Welcome to the kind of woman power that sustained our grandmothers for 72 years in their struggle to get the right to vote. Welcome to the new wave of feminism. Welcome to each other. Welcome home.
Second wave feminists and advocates for the women's liberation movement in the 1960s through the 1980s sought equality for women in American culture and the economy. Women like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem led the movement to reach many of its goals throughout the 1980s, forming groups such as NOW, the National Organization for Women, to fight for changes in legislation. Second wave feminism was sparked as a result of the harsh ideals placed on women, the lack of economic opportunities they were presented with, and the social discrimination they faced. The women's liberation movement that coincided with second-wave feminism reached many goals as far as passing legislation and changing women's place in American society. Historians consider there to be three waves of feminism. The first in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, the second between the 1960s and 80s, and the third beginning in the 90s. First wave feminism mainly focused on increasing legal opportunities for women, focusing on suffrage. It was led by middle-class, white women who took a variety of approaches to get legislation passed. Many of these approaches, like marches and protests, were continually used throughout the second wave, although the second wave fought for equality in more forms than just legal rights. Many also see second-wave feminism as picking up where the first wave left off, starting when women began to lose the voice they gained during the first wave. Most of the strategies and ideas proposed in the second wave were truly taken from the first, and in this way, the first wave set the stage for the movement originating in the 60s. For example, although it was almost passed in the 60s, the Equal Rights Amendment was actually created and introduced in the 1920s, showing that the second movement was really just elaborating on the first. Although it's true that the start of the second wave coincided with when women lost most of the momentum that they had gained from the first wave, there were many other reasons that triggered it as well. One such reason is the harsh ideals and housewife standard for women in the 50s and 60s. The existence of the housewife rose to prominence in these decades and quickly became a very limiting archetype for American women. Wives at this time spent an average of 55 hours a week on domestic chores, limiting their lives almost solely to the home. In fact, the start of the women's movement itself is usually attributed to the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and its widespread popularity. The Feminine Mystique exposed the unhappiness of suburban housewives in the 50s and 60s, suggesting that women needed more than children and a husband to be fulfilled, and was backed by overwhelming support from American women. The book assured thousands of housewives that they were not alone with their feelings of isolation and encouraged them to speak up and join the movement. For this reason, the feminine mystique is thought to have marked the start of the movement by bringing awareness to one of the main oppressions on women at the time, the housewife ideal. The housewife ideal was accompanied by a set of beauty ideals represented by cultural events such as the Miss America pageant, which the women's liberation movement specifically fought. A flyer distributed by the Radical Women of New York in 1968 describes the organization's laments about the pageant, such as the way it objectifies women, promotes racism, and how it really just exists to benefit the capitalistic system. Flyers like these advertised protesting against the pageant, making it into a large cause with many rallies and protests, showing the movement's reactions to the stereotypes that women at the time were expected to fill. Even if women were able to overcome the harsh societal ideals, they were still extremely limited when it came to finding jobs and bringing in a steady income. The 38% of American women who worked in 1960 were largely limited to jobs as a teacher, nurse, or secretary. Not only did they have a lack of job opportunities and face societal discrimination if they chose to enter the workforce, but the salaries for those jobs were even more limiting. From 1960 to 1980, the wage gap fluctuated at around 60%. Although having a job as a secretary was often romanticized in the media, these women were often subjected to sexual discrimination in the workplace and paid very little. Kathy Roche, a feminist during the movement, discussed the misconceptions about women in the workforce, concluding that although secretaries might seem enviable, they are simply working models of the domestic sexual functionary. This idea was important because it helped remove the counter-argument that many gave to women, that there were indeed opportunities to be had. The feminine mystique was not Betty Friedan's only contribution to the movement. Friedan was in fact one of the primary leaders of the movement and inspired a lot of change with women. In a 1952 speech, well before the movement even began, Betty Friedan pointed out the unfair workplace conditions that women faced at the time. Her speech outlined the corruption of the few corporations that were even hiring women at the time, explaining that these corporations made $5.4 billion off the exploitation of women in 1950 alone. This speech was meant to empower women to stand up and make a difference, and although it took a few years, Friedan got her wish. The lack of economic opportunities was one of the largest causes of the movement, and was something that the movement managed to pass legislation for. American lawyer Martha Wright Griffiths helped push the Sex Discrimination Act in 1964 as part of the Civil Rights Act, aiming to help protect women against discrimination on the job and in their everyday lives. This was a major accomplishment of the women's movement and showed their dedication to end workplace discrimination and allow more economic opportunities for women. A third major cause of second-wave feminism and the movement was a societal discrimination that women faced. Aside from the extremely prejudiced housewife ideal outlined in the feminine mystique, there were many other ways that women faced sexism during the time of the movement. Until the Title IX amendments were passed in 1972, women were usually not allowed to participate in school athletics and also faced discrimination in the classroom. Title IX outlawed gender discrimination in schools and federally funded activities, which was a major success for women. There were also many small instances of oppression in society as well, such as, in the 1960s, a bank could refuse to issue a credit card to an unmarried woman, and even if she was married, her husband was required to co-sign. Many feminists focus on the case of societal discrimination for women, such as Jo Freeman, who wrote that, quote, social mythology firmly ensconced women in the home, unquote. Freeman spoke out to American women to fight the discrimination they faced through politics via her speeches and various papers on the women's movement. Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to Congress, also spoke out against the societal discrimination that women faced. When talking to the House of Representatives, Chisholm stated that she felt she faced more discrimination in politics because she was a woman, rather than the color of her skin. She went on to say that the issue of race in America was improving because people were willing to acknowledge it, and that it was time to do the same with gender. Women such as Chisholm and Freeman inspired many to join the movement in order to bring awareness and fight against sexism in American society, demanding legislative and cultural action. Just as second-wave feminism and the women's movement had many causes, they also brought about many changes. In addition to the aforementioned Sex Discrimination Act of 1964 and Title IX Amendment, there were many other changes in legislation that occurred because of the movement. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 helped to close the wage gap, although it was mostly hollow legislation. Many women in the movement fought for more reproductive rights for women, seeing success with the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, which legalized contraception. Because of this change, by the end of the 60s, more than 80% of wives of childbearing age were using the birth control pill. The other major success in gaining reproductive rights was Roe v. Wade, which controversially legalized abortions. These legislative milestones helped to broaden the economic opportunities available to women and end a lot of the discrimination towards women that was happening at the time. However, the movement did not only see changes in legislation, but also in women's role in American society. The movement's ideals enabled women to begin working in male-dominated fields such as law enforcement and serving in the military. Also, the personalist political philosophy of the movement led women to speak up for previously avoided issues such as rape and domestic violence. These developments were crucial for the movement and demonstrated their success in bringing about change. All in all, second-wave feminism and the women's movement spanning from the 1960s to the 1980s were milestones for women and opened many opportunities for them. Whether it was for the harsh societal ideals that were forced upon them, the lack of economic opportunities they had, or the discrimination they faced, thousands of women and men alike joined the revolution that brought about both legislative and cultural change.